Trump cancels U.S.-Iran meetings, urges protesters to take over institutions. This is not a routine diplomatic update. This is a moment where global politics steps away from negotiation and edges closer to controlled chaos. For decades, relations between the United States and Iran have been defined by mistrust, pressure, and indirect confrontation. Sanctions replaced dialogue, threats replaced compromise, and regional conflicts became substitutes for direct war. Yet even at the worst moments, one thing usually remained intact: the idea that talks, however fragile, were still possible. That assumption has now been shattered. When Donald Trump abruptly canceled planned U.S.-Iran meetings, the message was already strong. But it was his next move that transformed a diplomatic decision into a geopolitical shockwave. By openly urging protesters to take over state institutions, Trump crossed from foreign policy into psychological warfare. This was not just about Iran anymore. This was about precedent. Inside Iran, unrest has been simmering for years. Economic pressure from sanctions has crushed purchasing power. Young people face shrinking opportunities. Inflation has eroded savings. Political frustration has deepened, especially among urban populations. Protests, once isolated, have become recurring. The government has managed to contain them, sometimes through concessions, sometimes through force. But containment relies on one fragile assumption: that protests remain domestic. Trump's statement disrupted that balance. When a former U.S. president and a leading political figure encourages protesters in a rival state to seize institutions, it reframes internal dissent as an externally endorsed uprising. That distinction matters. In international politics, words are signals, and signals trigger reactions. Tehran understood that immediately. Iranian officials condemned the remarks as direct interference, accusing Washington of attempting to engineer regime destabilization. State media framed the move as proof that protests were not organic but manipulated. Security forces went on high alert. Surveillance increased. Lines between civilian protest and national security threat blurred overnight. This is how escalation begins. Not with missiles, but with narratives. The cancellation of talks removed a critical pressure valve. Diplomatic meetings do more than solve problems. They slow momentum. They give governments time. They create ambiguity. When talks are canceled publicly and aggressively, momentum accelerates in only one direction. Markets noticed. Oil prices reacted. Regional allies recalculated. Rivals watched carefully. Israel interpreted the move as further isolation of Iran, potentially increasing the likelihood of covert confrontation. Gulf states worried about spillover instability. Europe found itself sidelined again, caught between supporting U.S. pressure and fearing regional collapse. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the decision deepened political divisions. Supporters framed Trump's stance as strength, refusing to legitimize a hostile regime and backing freedom movements. Critics saw recklessness, a dangerous encouragement of unrest that could spiral into bloodshed. History offers uncomfortable parallels. From Eastern Europe during the Cold War to the Arab Spring, external encouragement of protests has often produced unpredictable outcomes. Institutions collapse faster than societies can rebuild them. Power vacuums invite militias. Economic systems break before political ones reform. Iran is not a small, fragile state. It is a complex regional power with deep security structures, ideological institutions, and allies across the Middle East. Encouraging protesters to take over institutions is not a call for reform, it is a call for confrontation. And confrontation invites response. Iran's leadership is unlikely to yield under public pressure backed by foreign voices. More likely, it will double down. Crackdowns become easier to justify when framed as defense against foreign subversion. Moderate voices inside the system lose influence. Hardliners gain leverage. This is the paradox of external pressure. It often strengthens the very forces it seeks to weaken. By canceling talks, Trump removed any immediate incentive for restraint. By urging institutional takeover, he raised the stakes beyond protest into rebellion. Together, these actions compress the timeline toward crisis. What makes this moment especially volatile is timing. The global system is already strained. Wars in Eastern Europe, instability in the Middle East, economic fragmentation, and rising great power competition have reduced tolerance for uncertainty. A destabilized Iran does not exist in isolation. It affects energy markets, shipping lanes, proxy conflicts, and regional alliances. Even a perception of impending collapse can be enough to trigger preemptive moves. Iran-backed groups across the region may interpret this as a green light to escalate, believing conflict is inevitable. U.S. allies may harden defenses, markets may price in risk before it materializes, diplomacy becomes reactive instead of preventive, and once that shift happens, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Trump's language matters because of who he is, not just a former president, but a potential future one. Every statement is weighed for intent. Every signal is analyzed for continuity. Foreign governments do not treat such remarks as commentary. They treat them as possible previews of policy. That ambiguity is destabilizing. Iran cannot assume these words will remain words, nor can it ignore them. The protesters, meanwhile, are caught in the middle. What began as domestic grievances risks being reframed as a geopolitical instrument. That transformation rarely benefits those on the streets. It invites harsher responses, discredits legitimate demands, and turns civilians into strategic pawns. This is where the danger truly lies. When diplomacy is abandoned and unrest is encouraged from abroad, outcomes stop being controllable. Institutions do not fall cleanly. Power does not transfer peacefully. Violence becomes a variable, not an exception. Trump's move has not started a war, but it has narrowed the space where war can be avoided. The question now is not whether tensions will rise. They already have. The question is whether any actor still has both the credibility and the patience to slow things down. Because once protests and power collide under international pressure, history shows that events move faster than intentions. And in geopolitics, speed is rarely a friend. As the dust from Trump's remarks settles, the real consequences begin to surface. Not in speeches, but in decisions made quietly behind closed doors. Iran's leadership understands something many outside observers forget. Survival in geopolitics is not about popularity, it is about control. When a foreign power publicly urges protesters to seize institutions, the response is rarely negotiation. It is consolidation. Security structures tighten first, not visibly, but systematically. Communication channels are monitored more aggressively. Financial flows are traced. Protest networks are mapped. What may look like calm on the streets often hides intense activity within the state. This is where miscalculation becomes deadly. Protest movements thrive on momentum, but states thrive on endurance. When external encouragement raises expectations that institutions will fall quickly, disappointment can turn into desperation. Desperation, in turn, leads to confrontations that justify harsher measures. Iran's government is unlikely to fracture under pressure of words alone. Instead, it will frame resistance as defense of sovereignty. This narrative resonates deeply in a country shaped by foreign intervention memories, from the 1953 coup to decades of sanctions. Even critics of the regime often reject the idea of outside interference. That creates a dangerous split within society itself. Some protesters may feel emboldened by Trump's statement, believing international backing has arrived. Others may withdraw, fearing the movement has been compromised. Unity fractures, the state exploits those fractures. Meanwhile, the cancellation of talks removes the last visible off-ramp. Diplomacy is not only about agreements, it is about signaling restraint. Without meetings, every move is interpreted through worst-case assumptions. Iran may accelerate nuclear activity to gain leverage, not necessarily to build a weapon immediately, but to remind the world that pressure has costs. The United States and its allies may respond with tighter sanctions or covert operations. Each step invites a counterstep. This is how escalation becomes normalized. Regional actors are already adjusting. In Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, groups aligned with Iran are watching carefully. If Tehran feels cornered, it may choose to project strength outward rather than appear weak at home. That means increased regional tension, not because Iran seeks war, but because deterrence demands visibility. Energy markets are particularly sensitive to this shift. Even rumors of instability in the Persian Gulf raise insurance costs, shipping risks, and price volatility. Global consumers pay the price long before any missile is launched. Europe, once again, finds itself marginalized. European governments prefer negotiations, but lack leverage without U.S. participation. China and Russia observe patiently, positioning themselves as alternative partners while benefiting from Western disunity. Inside the United States, the debate grows sharper. Supporters argue that pressure works, that regimes crumble when challenged. Critics warn that collapse is not the same as transition. Iraq and Libya are still reminders of what happens when institutions fall faster than systems can replace them. Trump's approach reflects a belief that bold disruption forces change. But international systems are not corporations, and states are not brands. They respond not just to pressure, but to fear. Fear of humiliation, fear of loss, fear of precedent. Encouraging protesters to take over institutions sets a precedent that other powers will remember. If normalized, it invites reciprocal interference elsewhere. The rules that restrain chaos weaken. For Iran, backing down publicly is almost impossible now. Any sign of compromise could be portrayed as surrender under foreign pressure. That leaves only two viable paths: internal repression or external defiance. Neither leads to stability. For the protesters, the road ahead becomes more dangerous when movements are perceived as instruments of foreign strategy. Their moral authority erodes. Even legitimate grievances become suspect. History shows that revolutions rarely succeed when framed by outside powers. And when they fail, the cost is paid domestically. The greatest risk now is not immediate war, but gradual radicalization. Each side convinces itself that restraint equals weakness. Each action is justified as defensive. Over time, thresholds shift. What once seemed unthinkable becomes acceptable. Trump's cancellation of talks and call to action did not ignite a single dramatic event. Instead, it altered the strategic environment, shrinking options, hardening attitudes, accelerating timelines. Geopolitics rarely collapses suddenly. It erodes. And when erosion reaches a tipping point, leaders often claim events move faster than expected. In reality, the warning signs were always visible. This moment will be remembered not for what was done, but for what was abandoned: dialogue, ambiguity, and the slow work of containment. Whether this path leads to confrontation or recalibration depends on choices yet to be made. But one truth is already clear. Once institutions and protests are placed on the same chessboard by global powers, the game becomes far more dangerous, and the cost of losing is never evenly shared.